The Moberly-Jourdain Incident. In 1901, a walk with Marie Antoinette. In 1901, two English women, Charlotte Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain, embarked on what should have been an ordinary trip to the Palace of Versailles in France. They were both academics, serious, rational individuals, visiting the site to soak in its rich history. But what started as a casual afternoon turned into one of the most famous time-slip stories in history. While exploring the gardens near the Petit Trianon, the women began to notice something strange. The air became heavy and silent, and an overwhelming sense of unease crept over them. The surroundings seemed to change subtly. Modern elements of the garden faded away, replaced by older, unfamiliar details. They reported seeing people dressed in 18th century clothing, women wearing elaborate bonnets, a man with a pockmarked face in a green coat, and even a lady sketching on a piece of paper by a small bridge. Moberly later became convinced that the sketching woman was none other than Marie Antoinette herself. The unsettling experience didn't end there. Later, when the women tried to revisit the same area, they couldn't find certain landmarks they'd seen, like the bridge. Investigating further, they discovered that several of the features they had observed had been destroyed decades earlier. They published their account in a book titled An Adventure, sparking debate about whether they had truly slipped back in time or experienced a shared hallucination. Skeptics have tried to explain the event as imagination or stress-induced delusion, but even today, the Moberly-Jourdain Incident remains one of the most compelling time-slip cases ever recorded. The Bold Street time slips in Liverpool, a portal to the 1950s. Bold Street in Liverpool might seem like any other shopping area, but locals know it as a hotspot for time slips. Over the years, countless people have reported suddenly finding themselves transported decades into the past while walking along this unassuming street. One of the most famous accounts comes from a man named Frank in the 1990s. Frank was running errands on Bold Street when he noticed the atmosphere around him change. The usual bustling modern street seemed eerily quiet, and when he looked up, he realized something was wrong. Shops like Waterstones and Topshop were gone, replaced by older storefronts with names he didn't recognize. The street itself appeared to have reverted to the 1950s. The cars were vintage models, the people wore period clothing, and the overall vibe was entirely out of place for the 20th century. Frank wandered in confusion for several minutes before everything suddenly returned to normal, leaving him standing on the familiar, modern-day Bold Street. But Frank isn't the only one. Over the years, many have shared similar experiences on Bold Street. From glimpses of old shops to encounters with people dressed in vintage attire, these incidents have fueled speculation that Bold Street is a time-slip portal. Is there something about this location, its geography, energy, or history that causes these anomalies? Or are these vivid experiences just tricks of the mind? The 1979 M6 time slip, driving into the Victorian era. In 1979, a man driving down the M6 motorway in England had an experience so strange that it has baffled skeptics and believers alike. It was late at night, and he was traveling alone when a thick fog suddenly enveloped the road. The dense mist made it almost impossible to see, and he described feeling an intense pressure in his ears, as though the air itself had shifted. As he carefully continued driving, the familiar motorway vanished. Instead, he found himself on a narrow cobblestone lane, surrounded by tall lampposts and houses that looked like they belonged in the Victorian era. There were no modern cars, no road signs, just horse-drawn carriages and people walking in outdated clothing. The man drove for several minutes, trying to process what he was seeing. The surroundings felt real, too real to be a dream or hallucination. Suddenly the fog returned just as quickly as it had appeared, and the Victorian scene dissolved. Moments later, he was back on the modern motorway as though nothing had happened. This story has been passed down in paranormal circles as one of the most convincing accounts of a time slip. Could the fog have been some kind of dimensional rift? And if so, how many others have unknowingly driven through similar anomalies, only to dismiss their experiences as strange dreams? Air Marshal Victor Goddard's 1935 flight into the future. Air Marshal Sir Victor Goddard was no stranger to high-pressure situations. As a seasoned pilot in the British Royal Air Force, he was known for his rationality and discipline. But in 1935, during a routine flight over Scotland, he experienced something that defied explanation. While flying over the abandoned airfield at Drem, Goddard noted how desolate and overgrown it looked. The airstrip was clearly out of use, with weeds sprouting through cracks in the pavement. However, on his return journey, a sudden storm engulfed his plane. The winds were fierce and visibility dropped to almost zero as he struggled to maintain control. As the storm cleared, Goddard looked down at Drem once again, and what he saw shocked him. The airfield was no longer abandoned. It was bustling with activity. Bright yellow planes were lined up neatly on the tarmac, and mechanics in blue overalls were working busily. The entire scene seemed modern, clean, and alive. When Goddard landed and shared his story, his colleagues assured him that Drem had been abandoned for years. Yet 4 years later, in 1939, the RAF reopened the airfield. To Goddard's astonishment, the planes were painted yellow and the mechanics' uniforms matched exactly what he had seen in 1935. Was this a case of precognition, or did Goddard truly slip forward in time? His story remains one of the most compelling examples of a time slip with evidence that seemed to predict the future. The Vanishing Hotel, 1973, A Night Lost in Time. In 1973, two couples traveling through rural France stopped at a small, quaint hotel to rest for the night. From the moment they arrived, they noticed something odd. The hotel seemed strangely old-fashioned, with vintage decor and staff uniforms that looked like they belonged in the early 20th century. Even the dinner they were served was simple and inexpensive, as though it came from another era. The couples shrugged off their unease and enjoyed their stay. The next morning, they paid their incredibly cheap bill, just a few francs, and set off on their journey. Days later, on their way back, they decided to revisit the charming hotel. But when they reached the area, it was gone. There was no trace of the hotel, just an empty field where it had been. Even more baffling, when they developed their photographs from the trip, none of the pictures taken at the hotel appeared on the film. The couples were left with nothing but their memories of a place that seemed to exist outside of time. Skeptics might argue that they simply misremembered the location, but how do you explain the missing photographs? Was this an innocent mistake, or did the couples unknowingly spend the night in a time slip? Time doesn't always work the way we think. From Victorian villages appearing out of nowhere to people stepping into the past on a quiet street, these time slip stories challenge everything we know about reality. Are they glitches in time, parallel dimensions, or something else entirely? What do you think? Are time slips real? Have you ever experienced one yourself? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the unexplained, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an episode of the strange and mysterious. Don't forget to follow us on TikTok at Uncanny Valley Video for more short-form content.